In the mid part of the 1800s, America was being ripped apart. Political, cultural, economic, moral differences were forcing apart the North and the South. Neighbor would turn on neighbor, brother on brother. In fewer places was this more apparent than in the border states. Some states choosing not to secede, but also not joining the Confederacy. Kentucky never seceded, even though there were many within its borders who felt Southern sympathies. Even within Nelson County, we had sons fighting fathers, brothers fighting brothers, neighbor against neighbor. We were a nation, a state, a county divided.
On October 15th of 1862, General John Hunt Morgan requested permission to stay in Kentucky. After Perryville, he had 1,800 men, the 2nd Kentucky Ganos and 3rd Kentucky Breckinridge's Battery. These were all Kentucky men. He asked permission to find his own way home and went back into central Kentucky. This picture represents Morgan's men at Paris, Kentucky in July of '62. Many of the illustrations we find of the Civil War are drawings. Photography was very young and you didn't have many successful pictures taken at the time, but there were many, many engravings, and we always try to find these engravings to get a picture and idea about what was going on during the war. Morgan decided to stay in Kentucky. As I said earlier, he didn't want to slink off like a beaten dog. His honor was at stake, his personal ego was at stake. He would come in and out of Kentucky many times in the 4 years of the war before his death, and each time he made the headlines. So he was one of the most written about of the Confederate soldiers. He's heading back into central Kentucky, and he's coming toward Bardstown in Nelson County. He's coming toward the railroads because the trestles on the railroad were the weak spots, the spots along the supply lines that would take care of serving the military in Kentucky. You burn down a trestle or blow up a trestle, it takes quite a while to build it back. Of course, the trestles didn't have to be the tall, very imposing bridges, but it took longer to build when they were. They could be the small trestles that went over streams. Anything that kept the train from running helped the Confederate cause. By October 19th, he's in Bloomfield. Now, again, Morgan got around on horseback, and his men were very talented riders. They not only were talented soldiers and riders, they were scavengers. They were always, that knew where to go to get some food, where to get some fresh horses. He had a telegraph operator who would send messages that were confusing, and he had a lot of talented men with him. It was a glorious group. They rode for glory. They rode for their Southern cause, but they rode for glory. He stayed in Bloomfield for 2 hours, eating and resting. He knew he had support there. Remember, he had come through Bloomfield and Camp Charity in September of 1861. He knew who to trust. The Louisville newspaper reported that Morgan was in Bloomfield and that he had captured our few sick and wounded, and he had probably paroled them because Morgan didn't want to take prisoners. Taking prisoners took your soldiers to guard them and take them back somewhere. So he usually would capture Union soldiers and then they would give their parole or their promise that they would not go back into battle. Now, I'm not sure how many of those promises stayed, but a person's word was worth more then than it is now. And if you gave your word you would not go back and fight for the other side, usually you stayed by it. Morgan's men were in Bloomfield. This was a Sunday, and Reverend Cunningham at Bloomfield, who wrote of many of his experiences during the war, wrote about coming in and finding the men in Bloomfield. And they had, again, the scavenging. They were trying to get themselves ready to continue to the next skirmish that they had planned. Cunningham said that he loaned his nephew money. His nephew was riding with Morgan. He loaned him a $5 bill. And that was probably, in his account, the most that he had ever supported the Confederacy was the $5 bill that he gave to his nephew at that time. He went on, Cunningham came on into Bardstown, and when he came into Bardstown, he met a column of Union soldiers who had heard that Morgan was in Bloomfield, and he was questioned about this, and he basically said yes, you know, they were there, and because he was a minister, he wasn't going to lie about it, and ended up that the Union soldier who questioned him took his horse. He decided his horse looked fresher than the one he was riding. This was a very common occurrence. It seemed like if you had a horse that had 4 legs and could hold its head up, the opportunity to keep the horse was very small, because someone was going to come along and give you a tired or worn out horse for him. But again, he accounted about the fact the Union knew Morgan was close by, but they were unable to catch him at that time. On October 20th, 1862, Morgan and his soldiers were close to Bardstown. They were at the fairgrounds. And the fairgrounds was the area north of town where the Louisville Road and Murray's Run Road and what we now call Old Nazareth Road, or at that time they called Shepherdsville Road, came together. And if you're going to rest or be alert and all, you're going to have more than one way to get out of a camping spot. And so that's why the fairgrounds would have been used by Morgan at the time. They had some information about a wagon train that was coming through. They were going to be carrying supplies to a Union division at Crab Orchard, which is close to Stanford, Kentucky. Well, when they heard there was a Union supply train, they made plans to disrupt that. So by the next morning, on the 21st, the Louisville paper reported that they had captured and destroyed at Cox's Creek Bridge a train of 51 loaded and 31 empty wagons, and they had captured 700 mules and a lot of supplies and a big mail. Now, again, if you hear the Confederate side, there were 400 prisoners, 600 or 700 mules, and maybe 160 wagons. The Union side says they only captured 51 loaded, 31 empty, and they didn't even say how many prisoners. The whole reason of saying that is that the accounts always differ in number of prisoners and supplies, but the story is true in that that supply train was captured by Morgan. They ran off the mules they couldn't handle. They let them stay there grazing up and down the creek. The other mules they ran off to be sold or to be used in the Army. They probably took what government stores they could use and burned the rest. This was the way of war. They said the Teamsters were marched out in the road and paroled. You can't have prisoners, they take up too much time. Morgan is causing havoc in central Kentucky, and he's making the newspaper. The Union Army has a mud on their face and that they can't catch Morgan. Now, his 1,800 men were not riding with him at one time. That was one thing someone talked about, how many men he had. Well, he had access to 1,800. He didn't have them all at one spot. They were riding around all over this part of central Kentucky, burning trestles, capturing supply trains, disrupting the mail, anything that would cause the Union occupancy of Kentucky, anything to cause them a problem, he was willing to do. It would be another 2 months before we heard from Morgan again in Nelson County. It would be December of 1862 when he came back to our county. And he came back this time on what's known as the Christmas raid.